Sometimes explicit implementation is required. One of these situations is when two methods have the same name and parameters, but different return types. In C#, we're allowed to overload methods with the same name but different parameters, but we're not allowed to overload methods based on the return type only. So in our sample here, we have two interfaces. iSavable has a save method that takes 0 parameters and returns a string. iVoidSavable has a save method that takes 0 parameters and returns a void. Because these method signatures are different, we need to implement at least one of these interfaces explicitly. We could choose to implement iVoidSavable explicitly as we have here. Or we could implement iSavable explicitly. Or we could choose to implement both interfaces explicitly. But we must implement at least one of them explicitly in order to have legal implementations for both interfaces. Let's take a quick look at this in code. Let's go ahead and add the iVoidSavable interface. And again, this will have a single method that returns void and has no parameters. So let's go to our implementation and add a class that implements both of these. So we'll say public class catalog, and this will implement iSavable and iVoidSavable. Now if we come in here and we say control dot to implement this interface, we'll choose to implement iSavable normally. And so that will give us a public string save method. If we come to iVoidSavable and choose implement interface iVoidSavable, notice what happens. Even though we said implement it normally, Visual Studio actually implements it explicitly. That's because Visual Studio says, you know what? I can't do a valid standard implementation on this, so you're going to have to take an explicit implementation. And it does actually matter what order we implement these in. So if we were to implement iVoidSavable first as a standard implementation, and then come to iSavable and say implement this standard, it will create an explicit implementation for iSavable. Again, Visual Studio looks at the methods and says, hey, I can't do this the standard way, so you must do it explicitly. And of course, if we wanted to, we could come into each of these and say, implement this explicitly. So what we've seen here is that Visual Studio has some intelligence built in. If it sees that we're not allowed to do a standard implementation, it will automatically give us that explicit implementation, even if that's not what we really wanted. Once we get that, we need to take a look and say, how do I really want to implement these? So Visual Studio will take care of a lot of explicit implementation for us. So sometimes we don't need to worry about it directly.